According to my next guest, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is treating students even worse than Trump is. Greg Sibley is a lead organizer and a founding member of Don't Forget Students. Greg, thanks for joining me.
My pleasure, David. Thanks again for having me on.
So before we get to the Trudeau-Trump comparison, give us just a breakdown of how the Canadian government has treated students so far during this pandemic up until what is happening currently.
So it's been a bit of a long and winding road throughout the pandemic. At first, many of your American listeners might have heard about something called CERB, which is the $2,000 a month that every Canadian got in the crisis. Well, there's a bit of fine print there. Every Canadian didn't get it. A lot of people did, but a lot of people were also left out. And one of the big groups that was initially left out of almost all of the government support back in the first wave in the spring was students and recent graduates, because they'd been in school for the last year and they didn't meet the income threshold for CERB. So students were really abandoned until we spoke up and we fought back. And that's something that a group that I co-founded called Don't Forget Students did, but also student unions like the Canadian Federation of Students, lots of like local student unions across the country, and the federal NDP, our left third party. They all stood up. We all stood up, I should say, in the spring, and we ended up getting a pretty decent package for students. It was definitely not as generous as it should have been. It wasn't CERB. It was something called the CESB, which a lot of your Canadian listeners are probably familiar with because they probably got it. It was a fair bit less money, and it was only for 4 months, but it was definitely better than nothing. So on that front, Trudeau's done a lot better than Trump. I have no arguments there. They also really increased the grants, and we were able to move them into doing some pretty decent things. One of the big parts of it fell through because of a big scandal. There was a charity volunteer program that was something called the CSSG, the Canada Student Service Grant, and that fell apart because of basically a corruption scandal involving a big charity over the summer, and the Liberals haven't gone and spent that money back on students. But where the very inflammatory statement that Trudeau is doing worse than Trump actually does come into effect is not actually for students. It's for recent graduates and graduates. It's for people with student loans, which is millions and millions of Canadians. And as your American listeners all know, student loans have been frozen even under Donald Trump. Even Trump was willing to freeze student loans throughout the pandemic. So nobody's paying their student loans right now in the middle of the crisis, which is pretty appropriate given the economic havoc that COVID has really brought. And that's really hit young people the hardest, I think, on both sides of the border. So it started off in Canada that we had a freeze like the American ones that went for 6 months. So it started in March and it was extended for 6 months. So that brought us up to the end of September. But for whatever reason, the Liberal government decided to end the freeze. Even though we were still in the pandemic, they decided that, hey, it's time to start paying your student loans back again. So, yeah, that's pretty shocking, I think.
Yeah, it's hard enough paying off student loans when there's not a crisis going on. The cost of education right now, I mean, it continues skyrocketing. I had to pay off around 30 grand in student loans that eventually I was able to pay off, but it took a while. So what are you fighting for right now? What are you fighting for the Liberal government to do?
So we're fighting for a few things. There's a little bit more backstory because it's pretty outrageous. Like you said, I mean, student loan debt is a really big issue in Canada. It's not quite as astronomical as it is in the States. It's considerably lower, but 30K is about average in debt for someone coming out of an undergrad degree. And that's a lot, even in a good economy. But in COVID, I mean, with the youth unemployment rates we're seeing, with how really everyone has been affected, paying those kind of loans back really just isn't possible for a lot of people. So we're fighting to get the Trudeau government, first and foremost, the first thing we want is to extend the freeze throughout the second wave. nobody should be paying student loans right now. It's wildly inappropriate to have someone who's on some of the government benefits because they lost their job. So they're getting maybe, $2,000 a month, but then the government is taking $600 of that in student loan payments. What sense does that make? And the really outrageous thing is that Parliament actually thinks so too. So there's a great NDP MP named Heather McPherson. She's the NDP MP for one of the Edmonton ridings, and she brought in a motion in Parliament a couple weeks ago to extend the freeze, to extend the loan moratorium retroactively from October until May. So basically through the winter. And Parliament voted on that, and it passed unanimously. So for a while, students were really happy. We thought that it was going to go through. Motions, this is a bit of inside baseball stuff, but motions are a bit different than like legislation in that they're not binding, as we soon found out, because the Liberals, and they introduced a big economic update where they rolled out a bunch of new measures about a week after that. And we were expecting them to announce some kind of freeze. We thought that they were going to do it because they said they would, and they voted for it. And all common sense would suggest that if even Donald Trump and Betsy DeVos realize you shouldn't be paying student loans right now, Justin Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland and Carla Qualtrough, the people responsible for this on the Canadian side, you would think they would agree, but for some reason, they went back on their word, and it's just totally outrageous. The only thing they did, and it doesn't help people right now at all, is they removed the interest on federal student loans next year. So it's no help to students who are trying to get through December, trying to get through the next couple of months. So our big push right now, don't forget students, the group I'm organizing with, and our student union partners, we're pushing for much more comprehensive support for students. But right now, kind of day one, I think in the short term, the big priority is just extending this moratorium because it's kicking people while they're down. I'll be very blunt about that. The government is forcing a lot of people onto payday loans. It's wrecking their credit scores. There was a huge fiasco with people that had automated payments set up through the National Student Loan Service Center that didn't carry over after the freeze. So they suddenly missed a payment because basically the federal student loan bureaucracy messed up, and people are waiting days to even get through to someone on the phone. But what's outrageous is that anyone in Canada has to even think about student loans right now.
What do you think it'll take for the Liberal government to respond and do what needs to be done?
I think we got to stand up and we got to demand better. We've got to demand some common sense here. And we've got to let them know that recent graduates, student loan borrowers, everybody in Canada expects our progressive prime minister to do a better job than Donald Trump when it comes to student loans. I mean, I don't think that's asking too much, if you ask me.
Yeah. The funny thing is, too, with Canadian politics, we often compare ourselves to the U.S., and it's unfortunate in the sense that it's such a low bar. Trump is such a low bar, and for Trudeau to not even be able to hit that low of a bar right now for students, I mean, really shows you that his priorities, that he just is not paying attention right now to what students and graduates need. So let people know where they can find you and how they can maybe voice their opinions on this, or voice their support of you in your fight for this.
Yeah, that's I couldn't agree more. I mean, Trudeau is really failing to clear the lowest possible bar here, and it's legitimately shocking. I don't think it's an exaggeration to call this a national embarrassment, and it doesn't make any sense. But one way to take action to change this is by signing a petition we have. It's a parliamentary petition with the NDP. It's sponsored by Laurel Collins, the great NDP MP for Victoria, and we're calling for a bunch of short-term and long-term measures, but one of the big ones is calling for the loan moratorium to be extended, and also for significant student debt cancellation as well. That's something that Canadian politicians have been sleeping on a bit, and we really need to start pushing here because student debt is a crisis north of the border too. So yeah, that petition can be found. Maybe we'll link to it in the chat. You can
Yeah.
follow me at GT Sibley on Twitter. I'm on Twitter a lot, tweeting about these things. And also follow Don't Forget Students on Twitter as well. And yeah, we can put the links in the bio maybe.
Yep, I'll put the links below the video. Thanks again, Greg, for coming on and letting us know what's going on with students.
My pleasure, David. Thanks so much for having me.